Hi, I'm Jennifer from Shabby Fabrics. I have a beautiful quilt behind me and I can't wait to show you how to make the block that makes up this beautiful quilt. The fabric is the Woolen Needle 5 collection from Primitive Gatherings by Motive Fabric. It's flannel and I absolutely love it. North Idaho, it's in the wintertime, it's cold, and I love nothing more than a flannel quilt to keep me warm. The quilt is made up of one block. It was very scrappy. I wanted to use as much of that beautiful flannel as I could, and it's just one block repeated with an inner border and outer border. Of course, there's a free download. We'll show you how to make that block and some basic measurements to put the project together. This is also available as a kit, and we also have a full color pattern available for purchase where we're showing you step by step how to make the Aunt Dinah block, which is what makes up this quilt. Now the Aunt Dinah block actually has 3 components. Let me point out the block, because sometimes when I look at a quilt like this, it's hard to pick out where the block actually is. So the block is here. It's a 12.5 inch unfinished block, finishing at 12 with a 1/4 inch standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you'll start with a center at 4.5 inches, and then we have 4 hourglass blocks. I went ahead and chose the same fabric to surround the center for the hourglass blocks. You could do something scrappy if you don't want any pattern at all. And then in the 4 corners of the block, that's called the cat's cradle, and I have a really cool ruler from Creative Grids that just made that going together, those 4 corners, so fun and accurate, because you do want a lot of accuracy coming together so that those corners line up beautifully and that looks like a square. It's actually 4 things coming together there. So let's jump right into this block. I am super excited to show you how to make that block. And isn't that so neat that it's just one block over and over? But look what a beautiful look it has. And I think some of those blocks, you don't have to get a fancy, you don't have to have a quilt that has 30 different blocks. It can just be one block over and over, and it's really beautiful. The symmetry of that I love. The repetition, I guess I should say. Let's build this center. Let's build the block together, starting with our center. 4.5 inches. Now for the hourglass block, you'll start with 5 1/4 inch squares. To make one block, you'll need 2 of the cream and 2 of whatever color you'll be using. We'll place those right sides together and we'll be cutting. Now, we've got some bias happening, and as we know about bias, it's stretchy. We have to be careful that we're not really getting in there with the iron and really kind of working that fabric, or we could distort it. Sometimes when working with bias edges, it's nice to add some sizing. So if you have sizing in your sewing room, I would encourage you to use that for this project. First thing that we'll do is we'll just go ahead and cut corner to corner. Now I love this spinning mat because I don't want to pick up my fabric right now, especially with bias. You want to leave that fabric as undisturbed as possible because fraying can begin, stretching can begin, and this is why I really just invest in the spinning ruler. If you don't have it, I would just encourage you to get it. I use it all the time. All right, so back to our block here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to pin that. And actually, I'm gonna start from down here. I really don't want that point starting in my machine because sometimes it tends to dive into the feed dogs. So I'm gonna actually sew from this point out and this point. So I'm just gonna rotate that. Just flip that real quick. That works. And again, and I'm going to flip that again one more time. So just a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let's go to the sewing machine. And again, I'm going to try to really just not be pushing and pulling. I'm letting the machine just pull the fabric along. I am simply just the direction. Alrighty, so we'll just cut that apart. And I'm going to press to the dark side. Notice I'm not pressing my seams open. Sometimes with flannel, it can get bulky. And so you may be tempted to press those seams open. But in this case, I want some really good interlocking seams. And therefore, I am not going to press those seams open because I do want to have some interlocking seams. Okay, so of course we need to match up our opposites. And then let's talk about those interlocking seams. See how I want that? I want that one's going one way, one's of course going the other. And I'm going to go ahead and put a pin right down that seam. I'm going to keep that there. I've got bias. I really want to control this, so I'm going to put in some extra pins that I really don't want to take out. So I am deliberately pinning on, not on this side, but on this side, so I can kind of just stay away. I can keep them in. I can sew along here without having to stop and remove the pins. I always used to pin on this side. I always did that because this is where I'm going to sew. But I have learned from Tammy, who you've met on many videos, she pins on this side, and there's a lot of logic to doing that because now I can keep those pins in place, which just holds the whole thing together. Okay, probably overpinned it, but I want to be sure. Got a lot of bias happening here. I've learned with pinning, boy have I learned. I've learned that you almost can't overpin, you can only underpin. And every time I've underpinned, I end up seam ripping. So that's been kind of my experience with pinning. It does take extra time, but I'll tell you, these pins are so sharp. These are the Clover, I think they're the fine pins. I love these, and the magnetic pin cushion keeps them all contained. They're a little bit of an investment, but they're worth it. And they don't melt because they have a glass head. So now look how beautiful that center came together. So let's see if we can't pop that center seam a little bit. There we go. I think we kind of did it there. Trying to get that to spin. My goal here is just to try to reduce the bulk in the center. Some fabrics will spin that seam a little bit easier than others. You know, the main thing is I do have a lot of that bulk removed. Just by being able to at least open that up a little bit was helpful. So let's look at how our block's looking now. And then I like to press it, of course, from the top and then trim those dog ears away because we don't want extra fabric going into, especially a flannel quilt, it's just bulky. So any extra fabric that you're not using, these little dog ears, just simply get in there and just trim them away. That extra fabric that is only just taking up bulk and adding to, when you're sewing blocks together, you don't need extra parts that you won't be using. So, looking at our block, here's our center, so the cream part is going toward that, so we would simply lay that here, and that unit will now measure 4.5 inches. I will go ahead and finish up the other one off camera, and when I come back, I'm going to take you to how to make the 4 corners using the Cat's Cradle ruler tool from Creative Grids. So I got my other hourglass block done, and I had 2 others prepared before video, so I'll put those here. And now we need to get to make our 4 corners. And again, I'm learning to use more and more tools, and it's really just adding to my fun factor of quilting. Not that I wasn't already having a great time, but now, you know, my blocks look so much better, and they're squared up, and so it just makes it go together so beautifully. Again, this is the Cat's Cradle tool from Creative Grids. It has a variety of size on it, all the way starting at 1 1/4 to 4 inches. And again, let me just point out what is the Cat's Cradle. In fact, let me just, here's the 2. I'm going to put that in the corner so you see where we're going. This is what we're going to be building together. We're going to be building those 2 corners. You can see how getting that together is not obvious, and that's why the tool is so helpful. On the tool itself, and of course it does also come with instructions with the tool. So if you do lose these for any reason down the road, they get damaged, you really do have the instructions that you need on the ruler itself, and I always love that. It's kind of a quick reference guide. On the tool itself, see if this will help you be able to see it on this side. There's 2 different images of the Cat's Cradle block. We'll be using the one here on the left, and that's what we have right here. You can see that that's exactly what we've done. We'll be using since this is a 12-inch block, that's 4, 4, and 4. These are finished measurements. Finished block size is 4 inches. So they're giving us the measurements of the 3 components that we need. We have this, and we have this. Okay, I'm going to be using that one right now so you can see what we're doing. So I want to show you how to be able to read the ruler so that you can make this, whether you're using your own fabrics or maybe even the kit. I want you to be able to read the ruler. So we know that this is just a square. You'll cut 2 2 3/4 inch squares. Okay, that's going to give you, what I'm going to be preparing is going to give you 2 corners. So just like here, you had to do that step twice to get the 4 units, and the yield was 2. It's the same thing. What we're doing right now is going to yield 2 corners. So you'll have to do this twice for each block. So that cutting the 2 to 2 3/4, that's going to be your corners. The cut to 2 3/4 by 3 3/4, that's going to be your color. In this instance, that's going to be my purples or whatever color you're using for your splash, I would call that in the Cat's Cradle. And then you'll cut 1 larger piece, which is your 5 by 6, and that of course is going to be your big triangle. So I just wanted to point out how to kind of manage using that ruler. So that's at least how to know what are you cutting, and that's at this point. Now you know what you need to cut. We'll go ahead. I'm going to show you what the next step is so that I can take you there. You'll just put right sides together, sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll do that 2 times, and you'll be pressing to the dark. So nothing surprising there, simply pin, 1/4 inch, pin, 1/4 inch, press to the dark. So we've done that ahead of time. Now, we will go ahead, and this is kind of when the ruler starts to come into play. I will show you this next step because I think sometimes it makes it a lot simpler to, let me show you where we're going to be going here. Okay, so I have those 2 units attached, and how they attach is I'm simply going to go opposite, right? I have the 2 units, and I'm simply going to just turn one around, right sides together. Let's put in a couple pins, and we're going to sew a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. Nothing crazy yet. Let's do that together. Now I need to make a snip here. And this is where you do want to have the directions. They do mention that's not going to be anywhere on your ruler. So I do encourage you to keep your directions when you purchase your ruler. So you see those right there. I've got a seam here and a seam here. I'm just going to find where I believe middle is, and I'm going to snip in almost to that cut line, or to the sewing line, excuse me. Now I'd be using my Kai scissors for this, because they're way sharper than this. And that cut, I'm going to cut a little bit deeper. Here's one thing I want to point out to you. This center portion, once this is laid out, is going to get cut away. So I can actually go deeper, and I am going to go deeper with that cut. There we go. Now we'll lay nice and flat. You'll take your larger rectangle and we'll place this right sides together. Actually, before I do that, this is when we go back and we're going to use our tool, because I'm going to go ahead and mark that, and it's a lot easier to mark that when it's not pinned to something else. So let's bring out that ruler. So on here, you're going to be using the side that says place on seam line, mark sewing line, because it's not obvious how to mark this. Here's where we're going, but it's not obvious how to get those marks. We all know how to go corner to corner, but notice you're not going corner to corner. You're going corner to somewhere else. So this is where the ruler, or the tool, is handy. This is what they're talking about. These are the seam lines. This is where I actually have sewn. I line up here in my corners, and I'm just, notice how it is coming to that corner, and I'm going off to a place that I wouldn't otherwise know where to go. Now we're going to rotate that around, and we're going to repeat that. So let's try that again. Place on seam line, place on seam line. This is where I've sewn. I'm on my seam line, I'm lined up here, I'm lined up in the corner. We'll mark. And now I'll go ahead, layering that together, just like we've done here. We've pinned this, and we're going to go ahead and sew, and I'm going to sew them both. So I'll get them both, because we need, actually I only have to do two, don't I? I already did two ahead of time. So I'll put this one aside, I'll sew this one, and then we'll finish up our four corners and how to trim. We'll trim our cat's cradle down, but we'll be sewing on the line for this step. I want to point out something here. Notice the distance between my sewing lines is far greater than 1/2 inch. And the reason I'm bringing up the 1/2 inch is normally if you're going to cut apart like we did on the hourglass block, you have 1/4 inch on that side and 1/4 inch on that side, and you just cut right up the middle. This is a far greater distance than 1/2 inch. This is why I'm going to go back to my tool once again, and with my rotary cutter, and I have a side now that says 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll lay that down along the seam I just cut. I've got that half, and then I'll again lay that along the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this center portion is just extra. Remember how we said we really don't want to add bulk to our block? If it's not part of that, we don't want to add that, because it just adds to the difficulty of sewing the blocks together because there are a lot of seams coming together as it is. Now we'll go ahead and we're going to press to that larger triangle. I like to set the seam. Now, how to use this. This is oversized. Remember how we said 4, 4, and 4? Of course, at this point, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2. This is pretty good size right now. This thing is not quite 5 inches, so we are going to be using our tool to trim this up. So we're here in this corner where we have our multiple measurements, and we're going to start here. It's very intuitive here how I have this sitting right there. My dash line is going down my seam allowance. I'm going to push down, and I can trim 2 of the sides. Now the side picture is a little bit different when you trim the other side. I will take my tool and rotate that 180 degrees. So now what I'll be doing is again, this is my 4, and I have a dash line right underneath it. That dash line is going to come sit right in my seam allowance, and notice I have this dash line here. I want to make sure that I'm not only lined up here, but I'm also lined up. That dash line is going from that corner to that corner. I'm going to just move that ever so slightly. So I've got vertical guidance and I've got a horizontal guidance. Now I'll just push down. See the value of this spinning mat. I don't want to move anything right now. I'm holding steady at this point so that I get the most precise cut possible, because that's what this type of block needs, precision. I'm just going to check that one more time. Looks good. There's that. And I'm just going to go through those steps one more time because this can be confusing. Just move that up ever so slightly. You know, once you get the hang of how to use a tool and you're doing it over and over, it'll be second nature. It's just that initial, how do I use this thing? Don't let that slow you down. These tools are worth learning how to use. So let me show you that one more time. So I like to start in that corner with the small square, and we'll start here. We've got our outline. We have our dash line running right along here. Lots of guidance here. I'm going to just spin my mat slightly here. Just a little bit more of a natural starting point. Oh, I bumped that just a little bit. Then again, we'll go ahead and rotate that 180 degrees. So I've got there's my 4, I've got my horizontal line up. I have my vertical line up that's going right in the corner. Up. Mama always said, measure twice, cut once, right? Let's make that final cut. And there are my 4. There's my block. Now that we have our whole block ready to go, you'll simply piece the rows together. In this instance, because I have the center block, which has nothing going on, right? It's going to naturally want seams going to it. When I approach a project, I sometimes think, how should I press my seam allowance? You may have a preference. If that's something you already know, go with what you know. But if you're uncertain, in this instance, I can already see that when I sew these two together, that my seams are going to want to go to the middle just because I have a lot going on in those corners. So in that instance, if my seams are going toward the center in this, they'll go toward the outside in the top and the bottom row. And then I would simply sew those together and press the seams open in the very, very end. So I hope you enjoyed learning how to make the Aunt Dinah block with Shabby fabrics.